Thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to talk with you today about monitoring your student progress, keeping students challenged. I am Claire Hayes, and I am happy to present this to you today. I'm also happy to be a resource in the future, so feel free to reach out if questions come up down the road. Today, what we're going to be talking about is, of course, monitoring student performance. And I just want to mention before we get going that there are two phases of monitoring student performance. The first one that's kind of grayed out on your slide right now is called checking initial placement. We presented that recently. That is a process that you do after your students have passed about 3 stories. The recording is on our website, so please check that out. It is an important process. It's actually considered part of placement. So when you initially place students into the program, you get them in the right level, the right series with the right goal. And then after they do a few stories, you take a look at the data from those first few stories and you check to make sure that they're in the right place. So please check out the webinar and videos on our website for additional information if you're still at that phase. Today, we're going to talk about that second phase, which is keeping students challenged. But regardless of what phase of monitoring student performance you're in, the most important thing that we all believe as educators is that we want to maximize our students' achievement. In order to do that, we know that students need to be challenged, right? They need to be in a level that is as hard as they can handle, but not too hard, because we can't let them be difficult or let them be frustrated, right? We want them to have a goal that is hard for them to reach so that they feel satisfaction when they do reach it, but they can't reach it too easily and they can't not be able to reach it or we'll lose them. All right, so keeping that balance is an important part of monitoring student performance. And so today when we're talking about keeping students challenged, that second phase of monitoring student performance, we want to keep that in mind, that we want our students challenged, but able to reach their goals. We want them to have to work hard, but to not get frustrated. So in order for us to get the information that we need in order to make good decisions about our students' levels and goals, we need to run what we call is the Students at a Glance report. Okay, the Students at a Glance report is available within your Read Live account. And I'm just going to pop out of my PowerPoint for a moment to demonstrate how to run that report in case you're unfamiliar with it. So I'll go ahead and log into my Read Live account as a staff member, much like you do. If I navigate over to the home button and scroll down a bit, you'll notice the last box at the bottom, the last tile at the bottom is titled Reports. You can also access that by clicking on your drop-down menu in the upper left-hand corner. So when I navigate over to Reports, you're going to notice again that we have 6 different tiles on this page. The first couple are administrative reports. The rest of them are student data reports from the programs that they work in. So today we're talking about Read Naturally Live progress monitoring, so we'll click on that report. The very first one that appears is called the Students at a Glance. So we can go ahead and click on that report, and I'll explain why this is the ideal one for monitoring performance in a minute. What you can do is click on one student, or you can click on groups of students to run the report for them. In order to click multiple at a time, you hold the Shift key down while you select the top item, and then keep it held down when you select the bottom item, and then they will all highlight. Otherwise, you can select them one at a time. You'll then, of course, click the only button available to you, which says Generate Reports for Selected. By default, the report date range will be the 1st of August of the school year to the current date that you're running the report. If you need to adjust that for some reason, you need to do that by going into the actual calendar and clicking on the date. Then that date will fill in that box. So if you have to put your cursor and click on the date within the calendar, and then you click Generate Report, and your Students at a Glance report will appear. You, of course, can print it. You can turn it into a PDF and access it however you prefer. So let's get back into the PowerPoint and we'll talk about why the Students at a Glance report is the best one to look at. The main reason is that what it does is it provides you with data on how students performed on the first 3 stories that they completed in a given level. and it compares it to the data on the most recent 3 stories that they completed in a level. So in this data report, every single column has a different data point, right? So the first column in the fluency section tells us what their cold timing score. Then we have goal, hot timing, number of practices, quiz, and so forth. So all those different data points are in there, and every single column contains 2 numbers separated by a forward slash. The first number is the average of the first 3 stories in that level. The second number is the average of the most recent 3 stories in that level. Okay, so at a very quick glance, you can see whether or not students have made progress. Because when you are working on keeping students challenged, you are taking a look at whether or not they have shown improvement. Okay, you want to see, has the student made progress on their average cold timing score, their average hot timing score? How about their comprehension scores? Have those numbers increased? Have they gotten better at those things? Has their average hot timing score become much or very high above what the goal is? 10 or more is what we say. So if there's a double-digit difference between the average hot timing score and the student's goal, that's an indication for a need of a change. The number of times a student has to practice, if that number goes down, that's also an indication. And then a student behavior. When a student behavior starts to change, that is very likely or often can be because a student needs more of a challenge. So if your student was loving this program in August and September and they're starting to kind of waver on how much they like it, it could be that they need a higher level or goal to kind of re-engage them. Okay. Now that checking initial placement part that I mentioned at the beginning, what you do with that is you still run that students at a glance report, but you're checking to make sure based off of our placement requirements, okay? Once you get to students having passed 6 or more passages, then you're into this phase that we're talking about today, the keeping students challenged phase. If your student has passed fewer than 6, somewhere between 3 and 6 passages, you're going to want to do checking initial placement first. So go find that on our website. If they have more than 6 passages, then you're going to be doing this process we're talking about today. It's important to have a couple guidelines that you keep in mind as you're making decisions about increasing challenge. The first thing that we recommend is that you only increase one thing at a time. So if you decide that a student's level is too low and you want to raise the level, you will then leave the goal as it is. If you decide the goal should be raised, you will leave the level as it is. Okay, one thing at a time so as not to overwhelm them. After 12 stories, you are somewhat more likely to raise a goal. And in part, this is because you have 12 more stories at that level, right? Because once you get to 24 stories, you have to raise the level. If a student passes all 24 stories, they're done with that level, they need to go up. But I want you to know that this is an important piece of information, and that is that students are ready to move up, not based on 12 or 24. Okay, if your student's ready to move up after 8 stories or 16 stories, that's fine. You don't have to wait until those points. But it is a nice way to kind of get a sense of what materials you still have available to you. So if your student's only past 12, you have the option. Whereas if your student is at or very near 24, you're running out of levels. So you're going to have to likely move that student up. The final thing, of course, is that we always want to be considering what their long-term fluency benchmark goal is, right? Now, not their story goal, but their long-term benchmark goal. So let's just reiterate what that is for a moment. A long-term fluency benchmark goal, of course, is that a student can read unpracticed grade level material at, near, or above the 50th percentile on oral reading fluency norms. Okay, so as an example, that means that a 4th grade student can read a 4th grade passage the first time he reads the 4th grade passage around the 50th percentile on national norms. Okay, they can read at their grade level the very first time. So we looked at oral reading fluency norms tables to determine which of our kids needed this intervention in the fall, right? That's probably what you spent a good chunk of August and or September doing. And those kids who ended up being identified as struggling ended up in our intervention rooms. So what you want them to be is where you want them to be in the spring of the year. By the end of the school year, you want the student to be reading at or around the 50th percentile on their grade level when reading their grade level material. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to walk through a student together. We're going to take a look at the data. I'm going to show you all the information that you need in order to answer these questions. And that has all these questions are the questions about whether or not there's progress for this student. Okay. We say that if you answer yes, if the student has made progress in 2 or more of the areas, that means the student likely needs more of a challenge. Okay, so the progress in 2 or more areas likely needs more of a challenge. So let's take a look at Lee and some of his data. Now, it's important to take a look at some information that is not really his data, but rather just general information about Lee. So we can see that in that first column, we see the series. He's in the sequence series, level 2.5. That's that first red circle. The next red circle over is that he has passed 12 stories. Okay, so we know that Lee is a 3rd grader working at mid-2nd grade level, and he's passed 12 stories in that level so far. So the next question we have to ask ourselves is, has Lee's average cold timing score improved? Okay, so before I show you where it is, try to find that information on the table. Now I'll go ahead and circle it so you can kind of teach your eyes where to go. And as you can see, the first number in this column is 41. So after the first 3 stories in level 2.5, his average cold timing score was 41. After the most recent 3 stories, so story number 10, 11, and 12, right? Because he's past 12. So his most recent 3 stories, his average cold score is 48. So yes, he has made progress in that area. What about his average hot timing score? See if you can find that column. We can see that his hot timing has also made progress from 74 to 80. Is his hot timing score above his goal by a double-digit number, by 10 or more? Okay, so now what you're doing is you're looking at 2 pieces of data. You're looking at the goal and the hot timing score. You want to look at the student's current goal, which is going to be that second number. This student has not had a goal raised, so the first number and the second number are the same because their goal has not been raised yet. We want to look at the second number in the hot timing score because that's his current hot timing average. And yes, there's a 10-digit difference. So again, we think maybe we need more of a challenge. And what about the quiz? Has that gone up? Now, quiz brings us into the section that's white. That's the comprehension section. And he started out pretty strong at 87 and he's up to 93. Finally, his practices have gone from 6 to 5. So he's reaching this hot timing score with fewer practices. So do we think Lee needs more of a challenge? Absolutely, right? He's probably a very easy case because he's made progress all over the board. So we definitely want to give Lee a little bit more of a challenge when working in Read Naturally Live. So now we have to decide, well, what do we do? Do we raise his level? Do we raise his goal? And so for that question, we ask ourselves 3 questions. We ask ourselves how many stories he's completed. So how much more content do I have at that readability level? We ask ourselves, what is his long-term fluency goal? Where do I want him ultimately? And which is he closer to? Now, this is a little bit of a kind of an interesting way to view it, but is Lee closer to reading material that is at his grade level? So is the grade level he's working at closer to where we want him to be? Or is the rate that he's able to read at closer to where we want him to be? Okay, so for the answers to those questions, we need some oral reading fluency data, all right? And we do have a norms table on our website, so you can go ahead, if you go to readnaturally.com and put in the search function oral reading fluency norms, one will come up. For those of you who use a formal benchmark assessment tool, there's one, they're built in there. Okay, so as we can see, the first question, we already circled that number. So Lee has completed 12 stories. All right, so that means he's got a lot more stories in this level. I can leave him in this level because he's got a whole bunch more content to go. So I might be more inclined to raise his goal. The next question is what is his long-term benchmark fluency goal? Okay, so now we're going to look down at this bottom table down here where we see the 50th percentile for oral reading fluency. We want a 3rd grade Lee, he's a third grader. So in the spring, we want him reading 112 words correct per minute the first time he reads a third grade passage. Okay. So what is he closer to? Is he closer to his grade level? Is he closer to his rate? All right. So we're looking at his ultimate goal for fluency this year is to get to 112 on third grade level material. He's at 48 right now, right? Because his most current average cold score is 48. That is a long ways to go. He's got to more than double it. All right. Lee is a third grader who's reading at a mid-second grade level. So the content he's being exposed to is fairly close to the content his peers are being exposed to. Okay, so I'm not that worried about him being way left behind on vocabulary and sophistication of content. It's fairly close. You know, I want him to be higher, of course, but it's not a big discrepancy there. So he's definitely closer to his level, right? He's being exposed to just about a half grade level below where he's at. So what do you think you should do? Should you raise the goal or should you raise the level? Well, because he's fairly close to level, that means that I have the luxury to focus more in on rate, right? He's got a really long way to go from an automaticity standpoint. So when that's the case, then I'm going to keep him at the same level and really work on him raising that automaticity. So I would raise Lee's goal, okay? When we raise a goal, we raise by 10 words, usually. When we raise a level, we raise by a half grade level, usually. And those are, you know, general rules. There are exceptions, as with every rule. And then the final bullet point here is to discuss the change with the student. And I like to talk about this just for a moment because it's important for a few reasons. For one, it's a fun conversation for you, and it's a fun conversation for the student. And we know that we have to have conversations with our students that aren't as fun as we want them to be. We'd rather have more positive conversations. And so this is an opportunity to do that. And everybody feels good afterwards. The other reason is maybe not quite as obvious. And that has to do with the fact that at the end of the day, your student is the one who is in charge of his progress. You cannot do the practicing for him. You can't read for him. How much progress Lee makes is how many words Lee reads during intervention time, how well he stays on task. So talking about the change, bringing him into the decision-making process helps him understand that on a more personal level. It helps him understand that really at the end of the day, he's the one in charge of his progress, not you. And so talking about that change and having him be part of that decision helps him get used to that idea that he needs to be the one in charge of how much progress he makes. So we decided that raising Lee's goal was the best thing to do for him. And we also told you that we raised the goal by 10, right? So of course, Lee's new goal then is going to be 80. And you would make that change in Read Live. Okay. I'm going to show you how to make that change in Read Live. I'm going to go back. I'm logged in as a teacher into Read Live. So I'll go back to my home screen so we all know where we're at within the program. If I'm making a change to Read Naturally Live to a level or goal, I want to go to the Read Naturally Live section of Read Live. So I can click on the tile or I can select it from my drop-down menu. If I find Lee's name and then I can scroll over to the right and there would be an edit button next to his name. And so I can click the edit button and then raise his goal to what is what I decided it to be. In Lee's case, we're going to raise it to 80. And then I click Save and Close. Okay, so now he has a goal of 80. You can also raise Lee's goal from the student module. So if you have a student logged in and you think, oh, shoot, I was going to change his goal before he came, but you know, the day does what the day all days do, and it got away from you. And now Lee is sitting at his computer and he's logged in. You can make the change from here. You don't have to go back to your computer. You can click on this teacher button with the picture of the apple. When you log in there and enter your teacher user ID and password, and that will bring you to the teacher menu. And so from here, the middle option is change series level and goal. So if you want to make the change while the student is in the program and you don't want to have to go back to your computer, you can come in here and raise the level or goal or make the change from the student module as well. Okay, so now let's go back to Lee for a moment. We talked about the fact that he needs a new goal. We raised his goal. I showed you how to do that. Now we need to just decide, do we think he's ready to be done with Read Naturally Live? Okay, so it's further on in the school year. We're going to take a look at his benchmark assessment data. Formal assessment data is what you ultimately need to look at to decide whether or not a student needs to use the intervention in the fall and whether or not they're ready to exit in the winter and the spring, right? So that is the best data we have. So in the fall, he was reading 36 words correct in a minute. That's what got him in our intervention. Now it's the spring and he's at 85. He's made a lot of progress. Can he leave? Is he done? Now, another place you can get data, can get curriculum-based measurement data, are the cold timings, especially if you're doing them with your students and you know those cold timing scores are accurate, right? And even more so if your student is reading pretty close to grade level, like Lee is. Look, in the spring of the year, Lee is working in level 3.5 as a third grader. So he's reading level that's pretty close to his grade level. His average cold timing score when the teacher is there is 80. We want him to be at 112. His formal assessment data is 85. That is the gold standard, right? That's the number we're going to look at. But I don't know about you, only getting data every 3 months is not enough for me. So I like to peek in between those periods, right? And sometimes that curriculum-based measurement data is all you have in between those assessments. And so taking a look at that can help. And if the student is reading at or very, very close to grade level, their cold scores will likely be similar to their assessment because the content they're reading is similar, okay? So we can see that with his formal assessment data at 85, his average cold score is at 80, we want him at 112, he's not ready to exit. We do not look at the average hot timing score. Just want to make sure that's clear. Average hot timing score is a score that students love, but it is of no value to us when we're comparing it to norms, when we're making decisions about exiting. It is really just a way to motivate kids to practice. There are no norms for how many times a kid reads a passage 8 times, right? So that is not a data point that is of big value to us when we're making decisions about whether or not they can enter or exit an intervention. So Lee made a lot of progress. He made more progress than his peers, but he's not ready to go. So Lee was a fun example because he made a ton of progress, but that doesn't happen every time with every kid, right? So I'm going to talk about some of the different common issues that come up. The first thing I usually ask when I get a call from a teacher who's not sure what to do about a student is I ask, is the student completing the steps correctly? The most common step that's completed poorly is that read along step, right? Sometimes kids don't read along actively with their mouths. They need to whisper read along with the audio support. You need to know that they are reading. Okay, so that's a common step that is done poorly. Also, clicking on words they're unsure of, letting them know that you expect them to not know all these words. You want them to click on words if they're unsure. That will help them learn those words, right? So taking a look at the various steps and making sure they're being done properly is kind of the first place to look. The next thing to decide on might be to make a program adjustment. And by that, I mean to adjust the story options. You can change the way the student works in the program. For example, if a student is frustrated with typing, you could turn off the prediction, you could turn off the retell steps. If a student is multiple years below grade level, you might want to do that even if they're fine with typing. Because if you turn those 2 steps off, that will give you a little more time where the student is actively reading instead of spending it on writing. Okay, so a program adjustment might help you hone in on some changes. Another common adjustment that is good might be instead of doing a 1-minute timing for the practice, you might choose to adjust some students' practice timing to a whole story timing. So there's lots of different changes that can be made. Every step is adjustable, often in many ways. Okay, and so if you're not sure which changes to make, we have blog articles about it. You can call us and we can give you some recommendations, but there are lots of ways to differentiate based on how they do the steps. The next item is classroom management. And what I mean by that mostly is one, ensuring that you're able to get to your students quickly enough. If your students are waiting for you for 4 or 5 minutes to do a cold or a hot timing, that kind of deflates their motivation. It kind of, harms their motivation. It also means they're not spending as much time as they could in the act of reading. And so if you need to bring in another body to help you with those timings, do that. If that's not possible, maybe allow more of your kids to do an independent cold timing so that you can get to them quickly. The number of passages they pass has a direct correlation with the progress they make. So you want students passing as many stories as possible. Tie incentives to things like number of stories passed each week. Your kids should be passing multiple stories a week. If you're meeting 5 days a week for a half hour, they should get through about 3 in a week. If you're only meeting every other day for a half hour, maybe they're only passing 2 stories a week on the weeks you have them 3 times. Okay, so incentivizing those kinds of things. Have incentives for how many stories an individual pass each week, as well as how many stories the group passes, right? Get a little peer pressure on staying on task and try to get them to work as a team to get that number up. So some of those tips, again, we have fun blog articles about incentive programs and different tools that you can utilize for that. Another thing to provide would be supplementary instruction. So sometimes you might have a student who you realize struggles with certain phonics problems. We have our multisyllabic level of word warm-ups live is in the program now. It's been in there for about a month, and there's a lot of students who are older who need help with decoding those multisyllabic words. So if you have a student who's really still struggling with that, putting them in word warm-ups live level 3, where they practice segmenting and blending together, might be a good supplementary instruction option for students who are kind of stalled out. You also might decide to provide some comprehension instruction. So there's different options that you might choose depending on this particular issue. And then finally, adjusting a level or a goal, it might be a good boost. Sometimes kids just need to see that they're making progress, right? We all want to know that we're going forward. We're not a little mouse on a wheel. And so sometimes challenging them a little bit more with a harder level or a higher goal might be enough to kind of jumpstart their progress back into where we want it to be. All right, so now we're going to talk about 3 students, Jeff, John, and Janelle. And we're going to look at their data, and we're going to just kind of see the different options that we might have, what we naturally would recommend it to be. As with many parts of educating students, there's gray area, right? There isn't on off. It's not yes, no. There is area that there's quite a bit of nuance to. Okay, so we'll talk through this process with these 3 students. We'll highlight some of the changes and the differences based on the information you know about the student. So of course, you're going to use the report that you need for analyzing performance. It's that monitoring student, or that's that student at a glance report. Okay, so you'll run the report on all your students. In your handout, you have a takeaway. It's a full page that lists all of the data you need for monitoring student performance. In fact, it lists all the data you need for checking initial placement, that first part of monitoring student performance, as well as all the data and information you need for keeping students challenged, that second phase that we're talking about now. So that handout has this 1-page sheet, gives you all the information about where our levels are at, what our placement guide is, provides some oral reading fluency 50th percentile numbers for you. So that is a helpful tool in that handout. All right, we're going to talk about Jeff first. And I want you to notice underneath the box that has the 5 different questions we need to ask ourselves about Jeff, there's a little bit of information about Jeff that the report doesn't tell us, right? The report is good, but we know when we're working with students, there's things we know about the student that the report doesn't. In this case, we know that Jeff times himself. He's got a really positive attitude and he works really well. Okay, so he's engaged. He's doing well with his progress and with monitoring himself. So Jeff is a third grader and he's passed 12 stories. That's information that's on that first section of the report. The first question is whether or not he's made progress on cold timing. He hasn't. Now, remember, his cold timing scores he's doing on his own. So can't have as much credibility in those. And remember, if we answer yes, if he's made progress in 2 or more areas, then we think he needs to have a higher level or goal. Jeff's hot timing score has gone up a little bit from 93 to 97. His hot timing score and his goal are not a double-digit difference. There's only a 7-word difference between his goal and his average hot timing score. Jeff's quiz has gone up, and this is wonderful. We kept him in this level at the beginning. It made us a little nervous because we don't like to see our kids down in the 60 percentile range, but it paid off, right? He made the progress he needed. Now he's in a place where we want. Jeff's number of practices have been cut in half, and this data point influences the other data points because in order to get a hot timing score of 93 on the first 3 passages, Jeff had to practice 6 times to get a 93 on average. Now Jeff is only practicing on average 3 times and he's getting a 97. If Jeff practiced 3 more times, you better believe that hot timing score would have been a lot higher, right? So because when they get to the practice, they're able to go on to the quiz as soon as they practice 3 times and reach that goal. So if kids are practicing fewer times and reaching the goal, that tells us that that hot score would likely be higher as well. So we do think that Jeff needs more of a challenge, all right? He's made progress in 3 of the areas. And the next question, of course, is, well, then what do we do? Which challenge do we give to Jeff? So we're going to ask about how many stories he's completed and whether or not he's closer to his long-term fluency goal from a rate standpoint, from a words correct per minute standpoint, or from a level, from a content, from a readability standpoint. So Jeff has completed 12 stories as well. All right, that's listed right on our report. His long-term benchmark fluency goal from a rate standpoint is 112, okay? Remember, that is on that takeaway that's in your handout. It's also listed here on my slide. So we want him at 112 for a cold score on 3rd grade level material. Jeff is a 3rd grader working in level 3.0, okay? So which is he closer to? He has to almost double his cold score in order to be where he needs to be from a rate standpoint. But he's being exposed to content that's pretty close to the grade level. He's a 3rd grader working in level 3.0. Okay, so he's much closer to his level. When a student is closer to their level, that means you have the luxury to focus more on rate. You don't have to be quite as worried about vocabulary and content. So in this case, I would raise Jeff's goal. His current goal is 90. I would bring him up to 100, and I would make that change in Read Naturally Live like I showed you before. Now, what if Jeff was an 8th grader? Okay. So all the data is still the same. He's still only completed 12 stories. His long-term fluency goal is actually higher, right? Now we won't need him to read 146 words by the spring. He is very far away on a rate standpoint. He is very far away on a level standpoint. Both things need to increase significantly. So now we ask, well, what would you do? Okay. In this case, my recommendation would be to focus on his level. When you have a student who is 4, 5, 6 grade levels below, you've got serious issues with vocabulary and with content. And so when that is the case, you should be more aggressive with raising levels. It doesn't mean you don't also need to work on rates and automaticity. Of course you do. But as soon as you can get them reading more sophisticated vocabulary, the better off that kid is. So if the student is 4 or 5 grade levels below, be more aggressive with raising of the levels. So in this case, I would raise Jeff to 3.5, right? Now, let's talk about John for a moment. The note under John is a note that probably every teacher has at some point who works in Read Naturally Live. John makes too many errors to pass on the first attempt, okay? That's not an acceptable thing. We're not going to tolerate errors on past timings. He can have a few, but he can't have more than 3, right? So let's take a look at John's data with that in mind. He's making too many errors to pass on the first attempt. He's a sixth grader working in 5.0 and he's passed 12 stories. His average cold timing score from a very technical standpoint has improved, but I would not say that that is an improvement. His average hot timing score, again, it has improved a very small amount. His goal and his hot timing are not 10 or more apart. They're only 4 apart. His quiz has gone up a little bit, so that's good at least. And his practices have remained the same. Okay, so if you go with a really, really technical definition, technically he made progress in cold timing, hot timing, and quiz, that's 3. But the progress in 2 of those areas is very small. And the most important piece of information is he's making too many errors to pass on the first attempt. You can't give him more of a challenge. You can't give him harder words and a higher level. You can't give him a higher goal and make him try to go faster. Neither of those options is an acceptable one. So you're going to provide guidance to a student who's making too many errors to pass on that first attempt. You're going to need to tell him, I can't raise your level and goal. In fact, I might have to lower it if you don't get a handle on this. Probably John's not reading along with the narrator well enough. You might need to add a number, I'll read along to John. Instead of doing the number you have set for him now, add one more. Okay, make some changes to make it so that he gets rid of that error issue. But what if John had all the same data, but his quiz scores remained low? Then you're going to want to lower his level. Okay, so now you have a kid who's making too many errors to pass on the first attempt, and his quiz is in the 60 percentile range. We can tolerate the 60 percentile range at the very beginning when he's learning the program and learning the system. We'll tolerate that for a little bit. We can't keep tolerating it all school year. So if after 12 stories, he's still in the 60 percentile range or lower, now you got to lower him a level. Okay, so I would drop him down to level 4.5. I'd leave his goal the same. Nobody likes to do this. Kids don't like to be lowered. Teachers don't like to lower them. And you say to John, you know what? I think we got you in the wrong level to begin with. I'm going to put you in a little lower level. But as soon as you prove to me you can be accurate on those past timings, and as soon as you prove to me that you can understand and you get about 80% on that quiz, then I'll bring you back up to 5.0. When he returns to 5.0, the stories that he passed in that level will already be marked that way. All that data is still in there. Okay, so you're not messing with that data. All right, let's talk about our final student. Her name is Janelle, and she is like just the best. She's that kid who has taken to this program and she's run with it. Okay, it's always want to end on a positive note. So let's talk about Janelle. She is a 4th grader working in 2.5 and she's passed 12 stories. Her average cold timing started at 46. She's at 67. That's amazing. Her hot timing score it made incredible progress too, almost 20. Her hot timing score is above her goal by 10 already, and we already raised her goal. Look, her goal started at 75. I already raised it to 85, probably at checking initial placement, right? After 3 stories, I checked her initial placement, and I probably realized her goal was too low. So I raised her up to 85. And she's already 10 or more above that. Her quiz started out strong and she's at 100%. Think about that for a moment. If your students at a glance report has 100%, that means the average of the last 3 is 100%. She's gotten 100% on at least 3 passages in a row. That tells me the content, she needs more of a challenge with content, right? Her practices have been cut in half as well. So obviously Janelle needs more of a challenge. There's no question about that. The question is, what do we do? Okay, so she has completed more than only 12 stories. Her long-term benchmark rate is a 133 and her current cold timing is 67. So she's got a long ways to go there. She also has a little bit of a ways to go on grade level. She's a 4th grader working at 2.5. But she's still closer in level, right? I mean, she's got to double her cold timing score. She's only a year and a half below grade level. But what would you do? We've already raised her goal. Her quiz is out of this world. She's just nailing the quiz. She's making tons of progress. I personally would raise Janelle's level. Now, if you thought you'd raise her goal, you're not going to hurt her by doing that. It's okay, right? This is the gray area. But when you see 100% on quiz and they're making progress in many areas, then you can again be more aggressive with raising the level. She's ready. Okay. Probably after she does a few stories in 3.0, you'll probably be able to raise the goal at that point too. Okay. So kids like this, they'll just start to take off. And so when that happens, you want to kind of be more inclined to be aggressive with raising the level, especially when their comprehension is very strong. Okay. So you'd make that change in Read Live. So that is the information I needed to provide you with for keeping students challenged. As I mentioned before, that checking initial placement webinar was recorded live recently, and there's a recording of it, or was presented live recently. There's a recording of it on our website under the training tab, and then go to recorded webinars. And checking initial placement happens after students have completed between 3 and 6 stories. The Keeping Students Challenge that we just talked about, that's when kids have passed more than 6 stories, right? So I do have a little bit of time for questions. Christy, has anybody sent in a question to you that we should answer before we wrap up?
Yeah, if a student can read very quickly and consistently reaches their word correct per minute goal, yet has significant difficulty with comprehension and accuracy, what should the teacher do?
Yeah, great question. So that happens, right? If your student is, it's kind of like the example of John, I guess, right? If your student is making too many errors to pass on the first attempt, if that's the only issue, you're going to provide guidance and see if he can fix that problem. If he can't, you're going to ultimately end up needing to lower him. Okay. You're going to make sure that he's doing his read alongs right, clicking on all the words he doesn't know. If his comprehension is also low, you need to lower him. If his comprehension is at the 60 percentile range or above after the first few stories, that's okay. We're going to tolerate that at first. But if it's after 12, 13, 14 stories and he's still at 60%, then you need to lower his goal. And then you need to lower his level and get him in a place where he can comprehend well enough to move up. So great question.
We have another question.
Okay,
how do
great.
we disable the retell part of Read Live?
Oh, okay. Let me just demo that quickly for you. So I will log in as a student first. I can show you from here. When you're logged in as a student, if you want to make that change, you click that teacher button, just like I did when I made the change to the level and goal. There's something called change story options for selected. You can come in here, you can turn off prediction if you want it as well, and you can turn off retell. Okay. The other place you can do that, again, that's from the staff or the student module. You click that teacher button on the student screen. But if you want to do it from your computer when you don't have your kids with you, you go to your home page and navigate to the Read Naturally Live tile, because the change that you're making is within the Read Naturally Live program. You select your student's name and you click the blue button that says change story options for selected. When you do that, you can turn on and off steps by selecting and deselecting them. You can make adjustments to the number of required read-alongs. There's all sorts of changes that can happen within there. So those are the 2 locations that you can do that. Thank you for mentioning that. I should have mentioned it when I talked about it earlier, so appreciate the question. Christy, are there any others that came through?
We do have one more.
Okay.
How do you place a student who is a very fluent reader, but has very poor comprehension?
Yeah, and that is the perfect question for that checking initial placement webinar that's on our website. What we recommend you do is you take their average cold timing score after 3 stories, and you'd look at their comprehension score. If after 3 stories, their comprehension is below 60 percentile, you're going to lower them a half grade level. If they're at 60 percentile or above, you can leave them where they're at. 60 percentile does not feel good to teachers, but research shows that a student who can read at least at or who can comprehend at least at 60% can have comprehension gains. Comprehension gains are possible once they get to that threshold. So you will tolerate it at first. So you place them based on fluency. You have them pass go through the first 3 stories. And if their quiz is under 60%, you lower them by a half grade level and have them do the next 3. And I strongly encourage you to watch that checking initial placement webinar because it goes into great detail into how to do that process. So thank you all so much for your time, your great questions, your attention. Please reach out to us when you have questions. There is a survey that will appear when you log out. Please complete that survey to provide us with some feedback that will help us. And we appreciate your time. Have a wonderful day.